The year 1911. The venue, St. Nicholas Arena, New York City. It's where Princeton University played their home hockey games, usually to sold-out crowds. Tonight, Princeton's Hobart Amory Hare Baker, a prep school hockey sensation, is about to make his debut against Williams College, a team the Princeton Tigers just barely beat the year before. But this game was never close. Next morning's New York Tribune's headline reads, "Princeton trounces Williams 14-0. And the leading scorer, with 6 goals, is Hobey Baker, soon to be known to all as Hobey. The New York Tribune, December 22, 1911.
Throughout the game, Baker appeared at his best. This rover was everywhere, and almost every time he shot the puck at the opposing net, it reached the mark.
Hobey had already made a name for himself playing football for Princeton, then one of the top college teams in America. Los Angeles Times, October 27, 1912.
Princeton surprised the most optimistic of her followers today by defeating Dartmouth 22-7. Hobey Baker's work was, without question, the feature of the fray. With Princeton 1 point behind in the second period, Baker gave them the lead by kicking a goal from the 30-yard line. And in addition, made the most sensational run seen here this year. Gathering the ball on Princeton's 15-yard line, he dodged his way through the entire Green 11 and ran 85 yards for a touchdown.
Touchdown, Princeton Tigers.
Hello, I'm David Duchovny. I'm an actor and writer and sometime athlete, and like Hobey Baker, I also went to Princeton University. During my 4 years there, I was well aware of the legend, the myth that was Hobey Baker, whether it was his name on Princeton's hockey rink or portraits of him hanging in the Ivy Club and Nassau Inn. But that's not the same as understanding who Hobey Baker really was. While Hobey Baker is arguably one of America's greatest athletes, not just of his time, but of all time, many people have never heard of him. If you're a hockey fan, you might recall his name, which is engraved on the trophy given each year to the best men's college hockey player in America, the Hobey Baker Award. And to this day, he remains the only athlete in both the College Football and Hockey Hall of Fames. As a two-sport athlete, Hobey was the real-life natural. In an era when college phenoms like Baker were the center of America's media universe. After all, the early 20th century was a time before Hollywood celebrities, rock stars, or social media influencers. One of Baker's Princeton classmates, the novelist F. Scott Fitzgerald, described his encounter with Hobey this way.
He was an ideal worthy of everything in my enthusiastic admiration, yet consummated and expressed in a human being who stood within 10 feet of me.
People adored Hobey, and for much of his life he existed in the national spotlight. But there was so much more to him than the beautiful, preternaturally gifted athlete everyone saw. In his biography of Baker, Princeton alum John Davies wrote that with Hobey there was always a foreboding, a sense that Hobey was somehow playing out a Greek tragedy. So who was the real Hobey? We spent years examining his personal correspondence, conducted extensive interviews with experts, and countless hours researching in the Hobey Baker archives at Princeton. We went in search of Hobey Baker. And what we discovered wasn't just his amazing athletic accomplishments and his daring exploits as a World War I fighter pilot, but also the untold queer history of an iconic American athlete. So join me as we travel back over a century to a time when sports in what is today called the Ivy League were king, and Hobey Baker, uncomfortably, wore its crown. From 30 for 30 podcasts, this is Searching for Hobey Baker, Episode 1, The Natural. Hobey Baker was born in 1892 in Bala Cynwyd, Pennsylvania, and despite his being brought up in wealthy mainline Philadelphia, his path to athletic greatness was built on the emotional wreckage of a traumatic childhood.
Hobey's father and his wife, May Augusta Pemberton, they did have a tumultuous relationship.
Emil Salvini is the author of Hobey Baker, American Legend. With their parents' marriage coming apart, the 11-year-old Hobey and his older brother, Thornton, found themselves cast adrift.
Hobey's mother was not a strong maternal influence in Hobey or his brother's, Thornton's life. They tolerated each other until they divorced. May Pemberton managed to keep the Quaker City gossips in a turmoil for many years before she and Alfred were divorced. They felt the lack of a mother, especially Hobey, I think, for the rest of his life.
To get his boys away from the gossip, and also from his obligation as a father, Alfred Baker sent Hobey and Thornton to St. Paul's School in New Hampshire, a school known for graduating men of action and only accepting male students of the appropriate pedigree and class, like the Astors, DuPonts, Morgans, Kennedys, Vanderbilts, and William Randolph Hearst.
So Hobey and his brother were basically raised at St. Paul's from the age of 11 to 18.
Hobey's father asked an older boy and former neighbor, Ned Toland, to watch over Hobey at St. Paul's.
Hobey's father said, "Ned, we can't do much about bringing up the boy. Please keep your eye on him and do everything you can."
Ned Toland shared his memories of Hobey in a letter to Baker biographer John Davies.
I was happy to, having known the family in Philadelphia. Young Hobey soon showed the most extraordinary athletic talent.
With its frozen ponds providing black ice from Thanksgiving through March, St. Paul's became the birthplace and mecca of hockey in the United States.
One of the headmasters visited Canada, and when he came back, he had all this different equipment with him because up to that point, they used to play what was called shinny, and that was really just using a stick to bat a ball up and down the ice. So he introduced puck, sort of a modern puck that we use today, and ice hockey sticks. And he's considered one of the fathers of American hockey, along with Malcolm Gordon, who was hired there as a coach.
On cold winter nights, a young Hobey Baker would skate alone in the dark on St. Paul's Lower School Pond with just his hockey stick and a puck.
Not only would he sneak out on Sunday afternoons when you were not supposed to be playing hockey, but he would also sneak out on weeknights under a moon and starlight and stick handle for hours at a time.
That's Tim Rapley, author of Hobey Baker Upon Further Review.
And he couldn't look down at the puck because it's midnight, so why bother? And so he learned to stick handle without ever having to look down, which is really the formula for becoming a star.
Hobey's hockey teams at St. Paul's not only dominated their other prep school opponents, but even managed the David versus Goliath task of defeating varsity hockey teams at both Princeton and Harvard. But Ned Toland remembered Hobey not just as an amazing high school hockey prodigy, but also as a deeply empathetic and caring person.
The other thing I recall was his kindness with the younger boys. He was a god at St. Paul's. But after hockey practice was over, Hobey would invariably skate over to a group of young boys watching. He'd sort them into teams of 7 and play them alone. He was untouchable on the ice, but found subtle ways of allowing the younger boys to score on him. One of those little boys, Lewis Miller, told me it was one of the highlights of his life. And he told me that when he was 70 years old.
From an early age, Hobey's concern for others was legendary. Jim Deckert was a year behind Hobey at St. Paul's. He too wrote Davies about his fond memories of Hobey.
Our team was often used by the varsity team for practice. One day, Hobey flashed ahead of me to steal the puck. On turning to get away, his skate accidentally drove into my shin, opening a gap between the muscle and the bone of about 3 inches. I was carted off to the infirmary and stayed there for weeks until the doctors pronounced me out of danger of paralysis. He was the big man on campus, busier than anyone, but he still came to visit me twice a day without fail the entire time. It's been 50 years since that day, but anytime I feel like remembering Hobey Baker, I only have to stick a finger in the little hole that still exists in my shin.
Hey, extra, New York City's Knickerbocker Bank goes bust. Stock market crashes. Hey, read all about it in today's New York Herald. Extra, get your paper here. Still just 5 cents.
America's financial panic of 1907 drove Hobey's father, Alfred, and his furniture upholstery business close to bankruptcy. In 1910, with the Baker boys set to graduate from St. Paul's, Alfred was left with a fraught choice. With only enough money to send one boy to college, the likely choice was the elder son, Thornton. But Thornton didn't agree. He selflessly stepped aside to let the younger, more athletic brother go instead.
And that was a great psychological debt that Hobey never really reconciled, that his brother laid down his ambitions, his dreams for Hobey. So Hobey always felt a little guilty over that.
Not surprisingly, the college Hobey chose was Princeton University, where his father had starred in football a quarter of a century earlier. In 1910, Princeton was much different than today. It was all white, all male, and like St. Paul's, very much an upper-class bastion. Baker contemporary novelist F. Scott Fitzgerald described the campus this way.
Suddenly, all around you spreads out the loveliest riot of Gothic architecture in America. Battlement linked on to battlement, hall to hall, arch-broken, vine-covered, luxuriant, and lovely, over 2 square miles of green grass. Here's no monotony, no feeling that it was all built yesterday at the whim of last week's millionaire. Nassau Hall was already 30 years old when Hessian bullets pierced its sides.
Hobey's growing fame at Princeton rested on his sporting exploits. The great football player, and an even greater hockey player. He was also skilled at golf, tennis, baseball, and swimming.
What they said most about Hobey was that he only had to be shown how to do something once. There's one story where he was walking with a friend and they came by a building where there were tryouts for the shooting club. And his friend said, "Why don't you try it?" And he had never held a gun before. And they showed him how the rifle worked. And they said within a couple hours, he had qualified for the team.
Like many Princeton students, F. Scott Fitzgerald was in awe of Hobey. In his first novel, This Side of Paradise, he gave the main character Hobey's middle name, Amory. And the story even included a character based on Hobey, named Allenby.
There, at the head of the white platoon, marched Allenby, the football captain, slim and defiant, as if aware that this year the hopes of the college rested on him, that his 160 pounds were expected to dodge to victory through the heavy blue and crimson lines. Fascinated, Amory watched each rank of linked arms as it came abreast, the faces indistinct above the polo shirts, the voices built in a pan of triumph, and the voices grew fainter as it wound eastward over campus.
Kirk Kernet is a Fitzgerald scholar and English professor at Troy University.
There's a strong tendency in Fitzgerald for hero worship. You know, Hobey was the BMOC when Fitzgerald got there in the fall of 1913. The big man on campus, that was a huge deal in the Ivy Leagues, represented not only sort of the intellectual scholar gentleman, but the consummate athlete. And Fitzgerald wanted to be that athlete.
At the turn of the 20th century, football and Princeton University were synonymous. In fact, Princeton and Rutgers played the first college football game ever in 1869.
The Eastern schools that eventually formed the Ivy League, Princeton, Yale, Harvard, had always been important schools in the development of football.
Joel Bussert is a former NFL executive and leading authority on the early days of college football.
In these years, it's important to remember there's no such thing as a National Football League. It won't be organized until 1920. And therefore, in a certain sense, college football was the only game in town.
It was also a dangerous sport. After watching a Yale-Harvard football game, then heavyweight boxing champ John Sullivan remarked, "There's murder in that game." In 1909, 26 players died playing football. This caused some colleges, including Stanford and Columbia, to drop the sport. But Princeton's then president, Woodrow Wilson, a former football coach himself, was a fervent supporter of the game and the virtues of teamwork and fair play it provided students. Along with other college presidents, he lobbied to change the game's rules, making it less deadly by prohibiting flying wedges and stopping blockers from locking arms, and outlawing diving tackles and providing better protection for pass receivers. In 1910, Hobey's first year at Princeton, freshmen were not allowed to play hockey, so Hobey decided to give the dangerous game of football a try. Tim Rapley.
He says, well, I sort of want to figure out this football thing, and turned out to become quite a star in football because of his elusive, incredible athleticism, his speed and his stamina and his vision out there. I think Gale Sayers or Sanders from Detroit would be the best analogy of what kind of football player he was, incredibly fast and elusive.
Hobey starred as both the freshman team's punt returner and drop kicker, two key positions in early 20th century football. Back then, more yards were usually gained on punt returns than on plays from the line of scrimmage. Teams might punt 40 or more times during a game, sometimes even on first down. Hef Herring, one of Hobey's football coaches, described Hobey's athletic prowess in his book, 40 Years of Football.
I believe it to be absolutely true that he never dropped a single punt in 4 years at Princeton. I might add that his method of punt catching was to stand 2 or 3 yards back from where he judged the punt would drop, then start so as to take it on the run. It was risky, of course, but his record speaks for itself.
Hobey biographer Emile Salvini.
They had no numbers on their jerseys at that time, and he never wore a helmet. So he was recognizable not only by his speed, but by his blonde hair, which they said you could see flowing as he ran. And they said he was absolutely graceful, turn in any direction. And he did it with almost no apparent effort. I mean, he truly was the natural. And that people just were just absolutely blown away by watching what he could do. And he did it with no effort at all.
In spite of his small size, 5'9" and just 160 pounds, during his 4 years playing football at Princeton, Hobey set every school scoring record, records that stood for half a century, resulting in him being inducted into the College Football Hall of Fame. In 1912, Hobey was named an All-American, along with another football icon, Jim Thorpe. During Hobey's 3 years on the varsity football team, Princeton lost just 3 of their 27 games and were the consensus national champions in 1911, Hobey's sophomore year. And while Hobey is remembered for his amazing offensive plays on the gridiron, it is perhaps his final act on the field against his arch-nemesis, Yale, that is among his most memorable, and it was a defensive play.
Ladies and gentlemen, last call, all aboard the Princeton-Yale game special. The next stop, and in fact the only stop of this train, will be New Haven, Connecticut. All aboard!
November 15th, 1913. During the heyday of Princeton football, special trains brought eager fans to away games. 35,000 people watched Princeton play its final season game in New Haven against Yale, to the sound of Bulldog, Bulldog, Eli Yale. A fight song written by Hobey's friend and famed composer Cole Porter, Yale class of 1913. Early football expert Joel Bussert.
Late in the game, the score's tied 3-3, and a Yale player by the name of Ainsworth gets loose on a long, long run, probably most of the field. And of course, he's being pursued by most of the Princeton team, almost all of whom are losing ground except one player, Hobey Baker.
Here's how the Meriden Daily Journal described it.
The rabid crowd, fired to a point of frenzy, howled for a touchdown. Ainsworth was now clear of everybody but Hobey Baker, playing far back towards the Princeton goal. Baker set himself like a panther ready to spring. Ainsworth rushed along, first trying to dodge one way, then the other. It was a battle of wits. Baker wouldn't move, but just waited until he was sure which way Ainsworth was going to dash. For a moment, it looked as if Ainsworth was free to pass. Both of Baker's arms clutched themselves around Ainsworth's legs, and he began to topple over. Ainsworth fell over toward the Tiger goal line, just 6 yards from the coveted chalk mark. It was the best Princeton tackle of the game. It had to be, and Baker knew it.
They could write hundreds, if not thousands, of words and fill several columns of a newspaper about a game. It was what I would call the heroic age of sports. The players were perceived as heroes, and they were described in heroic ways by the newspaper reporters who were covering the games. And this contributed, of course, I think, to the legend of Hobey Baker.
One of Hobey's fervent fans was Woodrow Wilson. He was the former president of Princeton University, New Jersey's then governor, and the 1912 Democratic presidential candidate. Wilson would often walk from his nearby home over to Princeton's football fields and quietly observe Hobey and the team practice, something he happened to do on November 5th while awaiting the 1912 election returns. Watching Hobey and his teammates was Wilson's moment of zen, giving him solace and comfort just hours before he became President-elect of the United States of America.
The football team felt quite an affinity for Wilson as well.
Hobey biographer Tim Rapley.
And so when the results were confirmed, the whole football team, including Hobey, came to Wilson's house and serenaded him with, I'm sure, the Princeton, Old Nassau. Hobey loved to sing, and I'm sure he was front and center serenading the president.
But as accomplished as he was at football, Hobey Baker's greatest athletic exploits occurred on the ice. As a hockey player, Hobey was, and in fact still is, and always will be, sui generis, a player without parallel. Hobey played in the days when there were not 6, but 7 players on a hockey team. 3 forwards, 2 defensemen, a goalie, and a 7th player, the Rover. The Rover was allowed to range freely over the entire rink, playing either defense or forward. And the Rover was always the team's best player, Hobey. And also back then, there was no forward passing in hockey, and substitutions were rare, so players often stayed on the ice the entire game. Hobey also had a unique technological advantage, special skates crafted just for him. Tim Rapley explains.
When he was at St. Paul's, there was a trainer, Mac Smith. He worked with Hobey and decided instead of just having like 6 inches or 8 inches of steel on the ice like a ruler, they would rocker the blade, so make it look like a rocking chair's rocker. So there's less blade, less steel on the front, less steel on the back. And this would allow Hobey to make these severe cuts along the ice and take what are known as rink turns and special crossovers that would allow him much more agility, and it allowed him to do his signature move. He would go around his own net with the puck to pick up speed, and he would do it not just once, do it twice on these rockered blades to get a whole head of steam going.
In a guide to hockey, Baker even wrote down his tips about playing the game, referencing how he learned to play on cold winter nights on St. Paul's ponds.
To get out on the ice and spend 10 or 15 minutes skating around, never looking at the puck at all but feeling it at the end of your stick, is the best sort of practice for those who wish to become hockey players. The ability to carry the puck without looking at it,
enables a player to take in the whole field as he comes down the ice. He can see just where each man is placed and can instantly work out his course.
With his innovative skates and prodigious hockey acumen, Hobey set every possible college hockey record. Records that stood for decades. While official stats weren't recorded, he is credited with scoring the most goals in a season, 35, most goals in one game, 8, and most goals per game, 2.2. And even the opposition crowds were captivated by Hobey, often chanting, "Here he comes," when Hobey had the puck. Over his 3 years playing varsity hockey at Princeton, Hobey led the Tigers to national college championships in 1912 and in his final year, 1914. But Baker did more than just set records. Those who played with Hobey or watched him from the grandstands would remark on how he played the game with grace, a firm commitment to fair play, and always with good sportsmanship, and did so in a manner that has rarely been equaled. Vernon Andrews wrote about Hobey's legacy as a sportsman in his recent book that examined the cultural impact of white and black athletes.
So Hobey loved this British ideal of amateurism that had really gotten kicked in once the new Olympics started in 1896. And so he was filled with this idea of amateur ideal and shaking hands and knowing the other players and not playing for money. There was something higher that you played for other than money. And he was the embodiment of that. The gentleman athlete, shaking hands, being a good person to everyone, and really not taking much credit for himself. He was okay with losing as long as he played fair, as long as he didn't check anyone too hard in hockey. And he only got one penalty in all of his years of playing hockey in college.
In a 1991 article on Hobey's legacy, Sports Illustrated writer Ron Fimwright described what he termed Hobey's code.
A star player must be modest in victory and generous in defeat. He credits his triumphs to teamwork, accepts only faint praise for himself. He is clean-cut in dress and manner. He plays by the rules. He never boasts, for boasting is the worst form of muckery. And above all, he is cool and implacable, incapable of conspicuous public demonstration.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Boston Arena. Tonight, the Harvard Crimson take on the Princeton University Tigers. And here is tonight's lineup for the visiting Princeton Tigers. Starting at the rover position and co-captain is Hobart Amory Baker.
What many consider Hobey's greatest hockey game was one of the few he actually lost. It took place on January 24, 1914 in the Boston Arena. Hobey biographer Emile Salvini.
It was sold out. There was about 6,000 spectators, and they were actually scalping the tickets.
Tim Rapley picks the game up from there.
Harvard and Princeton had both split national championships the previous 2 years, and this is going to be the big showdown.
But this year, Harvard had an unexpected advantage. Two of Princeton's starters, Eric Kleiner and Grant Peacock, were out that night, leaving the Tigers low on substitutes.
You couldn't go back in the game once they took you out. So these guys were playing, no commercials or anything like that. They'd lose like 5-10 pounds during a game.
The New York Times, January 25th, 1914.
The most desperately contested college hockey game in years was played between Harvard and Princeton at the arena tonight. The Tigers, playing without Kleiner and Peacock, were greatly handicapped, but Harvard did not stop Baker as had been figured, and the Tigers' star was battering away at the Crimson goal all evening.
They played 2 periods of overtime. They played a sudden death overtime.
The Daily Princetonian, January 26th, 1914.
Twice during the second extra period came 2 brilliant plays by Baker, and it looked almost certain that Princeton would score the deciding goal. Taking the puck from behind his own goal line, Baker threaded his way with lightning speed past all his opponents. Each time, however, he was compelled to make a quick shot, which missed its mark by only a narrow margin.
And finally, in the 80th minute, a fellow named Leverett Saltonstall scored the winning goal, who was future governor and future senator from Massachusetts, a political giant. And Saltonstall would always say his greatest moment was scoring the overtime goal that beat Hobey Baker.
But Hobey's days at Princeton involved more than his well-covered exploits on the gridiron and ice. He loved to sing, to play his ukulele, and to spend fun times with his college friends and teammates. Early on at Princeton, he had been eagerly accepted into Princeton's Ivy Club, which, like Yale's secret society, Skull and Bones, was reserved for the college's male elite, even though Hobey lacked the wealth of many of his Ivy Club peers. More so than today, a century ago, private clubs like Ivy were the nursery for politicians, titans of industry, judges, and society's benefactors. During his senior year, Hobey and his Ivy Club friends attended a party at New York's Plaza Hotel.
So Hobey is at a bachelor party and they're drinking champagne. And evidently, Hobey's a pretty cheap drunk, 1 or 2 glasses of champagne. And he's getting tipsy and he's taking chances. So he leads a parade of these boys in tuxedos, out onto like the 3rd or 4th or 5th floor on this crazy ledge. And Hobey's just, prancing back and forth like a cat, risking life and limb and blowing the minds of all these tuxedoed Hobey fans. That was just all part of his persona.
Another frequent haunt for Hobey and his friends were parties hosted by Percy Rivington Pine II. 9 years older than Hobey, Percy, like Hobey, graduated from St. Paul's and then followed the well-trodden path to his father's alma mater, Princeton, where he even won the college golf championship in 1899. Baker biographer Emile Salvini.
As far as Percy goes, he was an interesting character. And, many people said he was a poster boy for the idle rich.
Percy was the scion of Moses Taylor Pine, one of America's richest men during the Gilded Age. The Pine fortune was over $2 billion in today's money and was based on transporting cotton from the South and developing the sugar trade between Cuba and America, crops dependent on slave labor. Moses both attended and adored Princeton, donating millions to his alma mater, helping transform it from a provincial local New Jersey college to a major national university. Between the 1880s and 1920s, Moses Pine wielded the power to hire and force the resignation of Princeton presidents, including Woodrow Wilson. For decades, he more or less bankrolled the university. Percy Pine took full advantage of his father's uber wealth, entertaining Princeton's top athletes along with bachelors from New York's elite families at Drumthwacket, the family's mansion in Princeton. Charles Biddle, a Princeton alum, was a good friend of both Hobey and Percy. In a letter to Hobey, biographer John Davies, Biddle recalled what Percy would call the rippin' days at Drumthwacket.
I came to know Percy well. He had a tremendous fortune, and it gave him great pleasure to entertain and give a good time to the younger men he liked. There were other men along, both of Percy's age, like Mike Vanderbilt, and a number of younger men who Percy liked to entertain. He drank too much, but was a very nice and most generous person.
In June 1914, Hobey graduated from Princeton, but he was not quite ready to enter the humdrum world of work. Dreading a life out of the athletic spotlight and craving new adventures, Hobey embarked on a carefree summer motorcycle tour of Europe with a Princeton classmate, Rolf Bahn. At the end of their European jaunt, in August 1914, Hobey and Rolf found themselves in London, staying with Princeton professor Augustus Trowbridge. In a letter to a friend, Trowbridge's son, Cornelius, recalled Hobey's visit.
Hobey drove a motorcycle exactly as he skated. Careening around with me holding on to his back was such a thrill. The London bobbies had never seen anything like it and just stared at us with their mouths open.
However, during the summer of 1914, Ominous clouds of war were gathering over Europe. The Manchester Guardian, June 29, 1914.
The Archduke Francis Ferdinand of Austria was assassinated in the streets of Sarajevo, the Bosnian capital, yesterday afternoon.
The Austrian Archduke's assassination set in motion a chain of cataclysmic events leading to the Great War, now known as World War I. The British Foreign Office, August 4th, 1914.
His Majesty's government has declared to the German government that a state of war exists between Great Britain and Germany as from 11 p.m. on August 4.
Great Britain joined France and Russia in declaring war on Germany. The next morning, Hobey and Rolfe impulsively tried to enlist in the British Army.
They were caught up with this sense of noblesse oblige. We want to be the noble class that goes off to war and takes on the Germans. And out of nowhere, a Princeton professor sees them and says, you absolutely cannot go off to war.
Professor Trowbridge reminded Hobey that his fame would make his enlisting front-page news and embarrass his admirer, President Woodrow Wilson, who wished to maintain America's neutrality. Chastened and disappointed, Hobey and Rolfe set sail back to New York. As their ocean liner departed for America, Hobey observed thousands of young British soldiers queuing on the Liverpool docks, mobilizing for France and the Great War. With Europe now at war, the British Foreign Secretary remarked, "The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime." So as Europe's lights dimmed, and with his athletic glory days at Princeton behind him, Hobey felt adrift, sailing home to what seemed an uncertain and dull future. Baker perhaps feared that he might soon become like the Fitzgerald character, Tom Buchanan, in The Great Gatsby. One of those men who reached such an acute, limited excellence at 21 that everything afterwards savors of anticlimax. But Hobey would soon learn that his days as an American sports star were far from over, and that his life would take a new and dramatic turn under the wing of none other than Percy Rivington Pine II. Coming up on the next episode of Searching for Hobey Baker.
Hobey is living like some scene out of The Great Gatsby, kind of on the arm of Percy Pine.
Dear Percy, God knows I have not deserved all the affection you have given me.
And he just had this on-again, off-again hero worship of Hobey. He couldn't spend enough time with Hobey.
I feel, and have always felt, that I have stolen it from some other person for whom God meant it. I hope not. Affectionately, Hobey. Searching for Hobey Baker was narrated by David Duchovny. The series was executive produced by Ross Greenberg, Andrew Reynolds, and Timothy Smith. From Silver Sound, the producer and re-recording mixer for the production was Corey Choi. The supervising sound designer was Luke Allen. Our original music and music supervision was done by John Sands and Wayne Sharp. The associate producer for this podcast was Evan Janikin. Also from Silver Sound, additional producing by Hunt Beatty and Reed Adler. Studio recording by Tom Fama. Location recording by Tarcisio Longobardi and Christian Cuccinello. And script support by Wenri Zhao. Special thanks to Stephen Arcieri and Matt Brody from Arcieri Talent. Our production manager was Christina DeLeggi, and the production accountant was Donna Brucale. Legal services provided by Jordan Manikin and Sam Bayard for 30 for 30 podcasts. This episode was produced by Carolyn Hepburn, Tara Nadolny, and Adiza Egan. Our line producer was Kath Sankey. Senior editorial producer for 30 for 30 podcasts was Preethi Varathan. The associate producers were Gus Navarro and Isabella Seaman. Production assistants were Diamante McKelvey and Anthony Salas. Senior producers are Marquise Daisy and Gentry Kirby. Heather Anderson, Marcia Cook, Brian Lockhart, and Burke Magnus are executive producers for 30 for 30 and ESPN Films. Rights and clearances by Jennifer Thorpe and Cal Griffith. Fact-checking by Daniel Tomorrow and Andrew Disler. This podcast was developed by Eve Troe, Adam Newhouse, and Trevor Gill.